story begin for you?
The AIDS story? Well, for me, like I guess many people, AIDS is a very personal story. I came out in 1981. I actually say I discovered that I was gay in 1981. Had really no consciousness about my sexuality regarding men at all at that point in time, at least not in the forefront of my brain. I was in a long-term relationship with a woman. We were engaged to be married. The marriage was actually pretty imminent. And as it got closer and closer and closer, for reasons that I didn't understand, I became more and more and more uncomfortable. One day I heard a radio interview, and I really don't remember how this came to pass, but it was an interview with the then publisher of Blue Boy magazine, talking about homosexuality, and kind of a light bulb went off. I literally went home and told my fiance that I thought I might be gay. I went to bookstores to get books. I told my mother that I was gay by that time. I told my mother that I was gay, and the next day I told my father, and and then the next week I met Chris, and it was, there was no turning back. Chris was my first partner. He and I moved to Los Angeles. I, at the time, was working for AT&T, and basically I just wanted to get out of the cold. I had grown up in Chicago, and I just didn't want to be cold anymore. And we arrived in Los Angeles, and we started a business called Black is More Than Beautiful. It's one of the first black giftware manufacturing companies, and we did posters and calendars, primary calendars, greeting cards. We did the first black beefcake calendar, as a matter of fact. That fall, he had a doctor's appointment, and he came back from the doctor's appointment and said that the doctor had found swollen lymph nodes. And I mentioned that I had swollen lymph nodes as well. And so we both had our lymph nodes examined, biopsied, and they came back abnormal. Chris and I talked about it, and we decided that for both of us, the dying would take care of itself. That in some ways that was none of our business. There was nothing that we could do to stop that. But we had full control of the living. I remember the first time he was hospitalized. It was at County General. We had a friend, her name was Mary Adair, and her partner Grace had a van. Chris was so sick that we took him to the emergency room at County General because he didn't have insurance. And he was in the van until we actually could get into the emergency room. And there were so many people in the emergency room that they had run out of beds. They had gurneys in the hallway, and there were so many gurneys that there was no room to walk between gurneys, that the gurneys were right next to each other, with people, including Chris, who were very, very, very sick. And our goal was basically to get him out. And so it began a process of he will get sick, our goal was to get him out. He will get sick, our goal was to get him out. And that was basically our lives. There were times when Chris was in the hospital, but 3 or 4 of our other friends were in the hospital. There were times when you would visit someone in the hospital, and then that same day, you would have to visit someone that was a deathbed. And that same day, you would often go to a funeral. And later on, you would get a call from someone else who just found out that they had it, or was having their first episode of pneumocystis, or had first found their first Kaposi lesion. AZT came out, and we all eventually were on AZT. And then there were all these clinical trials, and that I shouldn't say all these clinical trials, there were clinical trials. I was on a Salk trial, thinking that the Salk vaccine might be a window into a cure or treatment. AZT, of course, was there, and then there was D4T and 3TC and all these god-awful drugs that people would take. Well, once they developed the HIV test, you could then know who was HIV positive and who wasn't. And so there were those in public health who were from the school that the first thing that you do when you have an epidemic is you separate those who are infected from those who are not, as a mechanism of slowing the epidemic. Then there were those who felt like, of which I and most AIDS activists felt like, well, stigmatization then will reduce people's desire or undermine the effort for people to find out their HIV status, and that's a bad thing. And so that was that battle. But initially, the issue was, okay, how do we stop the epidemic? There were those who were from the school that you separate those who are positive and those who are negative. And then that was compounded with the stigma around homophobia and what have you, and that it was a plague and that it was God's will. Those issues began to come forward. And then there became questions around, well, everyone should get tested. And at that point, then Lyndon LaRouche led the effort in California, kind of really spoke to the elephant in the room. And that was the issue around quarantining people. And so he launched this Proposition 64. And Proposition 64 would have quarantined anyone who tested positive for HIV. Now in California, we had already dealt with the Briggs Initiative that would have fired any teacher who was identified as being gay or lesbian. And so we already had an infrastructure and an experience around statewide propositions and also around these irrational, discriminatory, initiatives. What we understood was that if it was perceived as being an issue that only impacted gay and lesbian folks, that there was a strong probability that with all the fear and all the hysteria and paranoia that was going on, that this initiative would pass. And initially the polling said that it definitely was going to pass. And so our initial efforts were to kind of make sure the public understood who actually and who all the people were that were at risk and how wrong this was. And so with that, we brought into the conversation the Japanese internment that had already happened in California, and many people who were in fact had survived the Japanese internment, got on board around this is wrong. After we won that battle and defeated LaRouche and Proposition 64, that's when, and that's actually how I met Eric Rofus. I met Tori Osborne during that period of time as well. And after that, that's when Eric called me and asked me to come work for the center. And then we began to look at the race question. And while the CDC was publishing the MMWR, the the weekly morbidity and mortality report, there was no emphasis on unpacking the disease by race. And so we began to contact the CDC and said, you need to begin to publish the disease by race so we can see what I already suspected, the impact of HIV and AIDS, along racial lines, the impact on blacks and the impact on Latinos and Asian Pacific Islanders. Blacks especially, we were disproportionately impacted by HIV. I remember hearing the stories that when white people get a cold, black people get pneumonia. And so my thought was immediately, so now that white people are getting the plague, holy shit, what do we think that's going to happen to black people at that point? In the very, very beginning, there were not a whole lot of people who were in Congress that were on our side. I mean, there were some folks who were willing to at least not do damage, but not really anyone that was willing to help. Now, Nancy Pelosi was elected to Congress expressly to respond to the pandemic. So she was great. Nancy kind of went in, and this was her issue. Maxine Waters began to speak out really, really, really early on, or depends on how you define really, really, really early on. But certainly when it came to her attention, Maxine was quick to respond. Ron Dellums, who were in Congress at the time, was pretty quick to respond. Barbara Lee, when she replaced Ron Dellums, she was right there and continues to spearhead the effort. The most important thing that we need from the government was sound policy and money. And Henry Waxman, in his position in Congress, was a champion in that regard. He listened to us. He had someone whose primary job was to respond to the pandemic. The other person that was not Washington but California-based who responded quickly was, of course, Speaker Brown. Willie Brown responded early. Willie Brown had a gay liaison. He had an A liaison when he was Speaker of the Assembly in California. Ed Edelman, was on the County Board of Supervisors, and he certainly was a champion early on. APLA was the first major AIDS organization in Los Angeles County. Now the center had a STD clinic and started to do HIV testing at their clinic and started to do some prevention work. But APLA was completely about the AIDS epidemic. And initially, the work was around educating people, the hotline, the buddy system, making sure people had buddies and support, when they were sick and dying, making sure that they were fed. When I took the job at APLA, I was the AIDS coordinator for the city of Los Angeles and a special advisor to Mayor Bradley. And APLA approached me to ask if I would come work for them in their policy department. At the time, they wanted me to be the director of policy. I wanted to have control of hiring my team because I wanted to have a team that reflected the epidemic as I understood it at the time. And in fact, there was a joke going on during my tenure at APLA that the policy staff was the United Colors of Benetton, part of APLA. Back then, United Colors of Benetton had a big campaign on diversity. And although I wasn't thinking about that company, I wanted to make sure that my staff did reflect that. And as a result of that, organically, the people in the room basically determine what the conversation is going to look like. And that's why it's important to be in the room. When you're in the middle of a pandemic and there's so much death and dying and sickness around you all the time, you develop an ability to multitask, to compartmentalize, and to suppress. So many of us experience death and dying at a premature point in our life, if you think about the cycle of life, right? And so we're in our 20s and our 30s and maybe in our 40s, and there's all these people who are dying when you should not know that many people who are dying, and they should not be in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And you're putting one foot ahead of the other, and you do not anticipate that you are going to live to be old. You think that you're going to die young. And then, in fact, you live to be old. And you lose your hair and your beard becomes gray, and then you're at an age where now your parents are dying, and you're at the age where people normally experience this kind of death. But you've already had it. And so it happens at the point in time where it is normal for you to experience this death. What's happening is you're just being triggered, because it's taking you back to another experience that you've not yet dealt with. And I think that's the way the post-traumatic stress syndrome is manifesting itself for me and a lot of my friends. And then COVID happened, and sheltering in place happened. And so what is happening now is, quite frankly, COVID actually, for me, brought back a lot of those unexpressed feelings of living through the worst of the pandemic, and some anger associated with that. Believing that we learned lessons and we taught lessons to the larger society that would be applied in the future, and discovering that while that is true, is not universally true. So how often do we have to repeat these mistakes around diversity and marginalization and disparities and what have you? We saw it in the AIDS pandemic, and we see it again in COVID-19. People often tell me and nudge me and say, you need to write a book, you need to get your story out, and maybe that's true. I haven't found a way to convince myself to do that yet. Maybe I will. But here's what I think. I think activism at its core is storytelling. I think the way you make change is about storytelling in real life. That when we bring our stories, our lived experience into houses of power, into Congress, into the City Hall and the County Board of Supervisors, that's storytelling, and crafting that. And helping people understand that they have a story, and they can connect their story to an actually policy that can change people's lives.